Silence choked the crowded diner when the bank's foreclosure notice slammed onto the counter. Everyone agreed the Henderson farm was already dead. Mockery echoed when the youngest son dragged a rusted 1958 harvester from the weeds. But the laughing abruptly stopped when that scrap metal crippled the local agricultural monopoly. The Iowa sun beat down on the Henderson farm like a hammer on an anvil, baking the cracked earth and illuminating the deep lines of worry on Wyatt Henderson's face. At 28, Wyatt had returned to Oak Haven, not in triumph, but in a desperate bid to save the only legacy his family had left. His father had passed away 6 months prior, leaving behind 300 acres of prime topsoil and a mountain of debt that threatened to swallow it whole. Mitchell Hayes, the regional loan officer for Heartland National, had made the stakes agonizingly clear that morning. "You're drowning Wyatt," Mitchell had said, tapping a silver pen against the mahogany desk. "Your input costs fertilizer diesel. The lease on that broken-down tractor. They've outpaced your yield for 3 consecutive years. You have exactly 1 harvest to clear the arrears or the bank auctions the land." The vultures were already circling. The most prominent among them was Calvin Brody, owner of Brody AgriCorp, a sprawling corporate farm that bordered the Henderson property. Calvin didn't just farm, he industrialized. He ran fleets of $500,000 satellite-guided air-conditioned combines that looked more like spaceships than agricultural equipment. Calvin had been trying to buy the Henderson land for a decade to complete his monopoly of the county's southern valley. Walking out of the barn, Wyatt kicked a clod of dry dirt. His Uncle Vernon, a man whose spine was permanently bowed from 40 years of manual labor, leaned against the weathered fence. "Calvin called again this morning," Vernon muttered, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Offered 80 cents on the dollar for the acreage. Said he's doing us a favor before the bank takes it for 50. "Tell Calvin to choke on it," Wyatt replied, his jaw tight. "Boy bravery don't pay the diesel bill," Vernon sighed. "We don't even have a working combine. The John Deere blew its hydrostatic transmission last week. Dealer says it's $20,000 just to order the proprietary parts and another $5,000 for the software unlock. We don't have 20,000 cents. Wyatt knew Vernon was right. Modern farming was a rigged game. The equipment manufacturers had locked down their machines with stringent right-to-repair laws. If a sensor went bad on a new combine, the machine bricked itself in the middle of the field until a certified technician drove out with a laptop to clear the code for a massive fee. Farmers didn't own their tractors anymore. They just rented the software. Wyatt turned his gaze toward the far end of the property, where an overgrown patch of blackberry brambles swallowed the remains of a collapsed equipment shed. "What about the ghost?" Wyatt asked quietly. Vernon followed his gaze and let out a harsh, barking laugh. "The International Wyatt, your grandfather, parked that rust bucket in 1982. It's a 1958 International Harvester, 101. It's got a flathead engine, belts made of dry rot, and a rat's nest the size of a bushel basket in the grain tank. It ain't a machine anymore. It's a tombstone." "It doesn't have a microchip in it," Wyatt countered, his eyes narrowing as an idea began to take root. "It doesn't require a software update to turn the ignition. And it's light. It weighs a fraction of what Calvin's monsters weigh. It also won't run," Vernon shouted, throwing his hands up in despair. "You've lost your mind. The pressure's cooked your brain." But Wyatt was already walking toward the brambles. He spent the next 4 hours hacking away the thick, thorny vines with a machete until the silhouette of the old beast was revealed. The red paint had long since oxidized into a chalky pale pink. The massive front tires were cracked and flat, sinking into the mud. The auger was seized solid with rust. That evening, Wyatt went into town to pick up groceries at the local supply store. The bell above the door jingled, drawing the eyes of the locals, sipping bad coffee near the feed counter. Calvin Brodie was holding court, dressed in an immaculate, unsoiled pearl-snap shirt. "Well, if it isn't the last Henderson," Calvin sneered, leaning against a pallet of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. "Heard about the dear Wyatt. Tough break. My offer stands, you know. I can have a check cut by tomorrow noon. Save you the embarrassment of watching the bank padlock your gates." "Keep your money, Calvin," Wyatt said, grabbing a gallon of milk. "We're bringing in the harvest." Calvin chuckled a condescending sound that echoed through the quiet store. "With what Vernon's pushing 70, and your only rig is dead in the dirt. I'm pulling my grandfather's 58 International out of the shed," Wyatt said flatly. The store erupted. 3 men at the counter burst into genuine belly-aching laughter. Calvin Brodie wiped a tear from his eye. "A 58 Wyatt, that thing couldn't harvest a window box of petunias. You're going to put that rusty museum piece up against my fleet. You're a fool. Farming has moved on. It's about data scale and capital now." "We'll see," Wyatt said, paying for his milk and walking out into the cool evening air. He felt the humiliation burning in his chest, but beneath it, a cold, hard resolve began to solidify. He didn't just want to save the farm anymore. He wanted to break the system that was trying to bury him. The resurrection of the International Harvester 101 began at dawn the next day. Wyatt managed to drag the machine up to the main workshop using an old pickup truck and a heavy tow chain. Under the harsh fluorescent lights of the barn, the true extent of the decay was staggering. The carburetor was completely calcified, the fuel lines crumbled like dry pasta in Wyatt's hands, and the threshing cylinder was fused shut. Wyatt couldn't do it alone. He needed a mechanic, but not just any mechanic. He needed someone who hated the corporate farming syndicate as much as he did. He made a call to Hannah Mercer. Hannah ran a rogue repair shop on the county line. She was a brilliant engineer who had been fired from the local authorized dealership for secretly bypassing digital locks on farmers' tractors, saving them thousands in repair fees. When she pulled into the Henderson driveway in her battered flatbed truck, she took one look at the rusted harvester, crossed her grease-stained arms and whistled. "Tell me this is a joke, Wyatt," Hannah said, circling the machine. "I thought you called me out here to hotwire your broken deer, not perform an exorcism." "The deer is collateral," Wyatt explained. "If I fix it, the bank takes it anyway. But the bank doesn't even have this listed on the asset sheets. It's fully depreciated. And I have a plan, Hannah. A real plan." Wyatt unrolled a massive sheet of blueprint paper on the workbench. It wasn't just a schematic of the harvester. It was an entirely different approach to farming. "Calvin Brodie and the rest of them practice high-yield monoculture," Wyatt said, pointing to the diagrams. "They plant corn and nothing but corn. To do that, they have to dump tons of synthetic fertilizer into the soil, which costs a fortune. Then, they drive 50-ton machines over it, compacting the soil so badly that it requires deep ripping plows just to breathe again. The input costs are eating the profits alive." Hannah leaned in, intrigued. "And your alternative? Strip intercropping." Wyatt said, his eyes alight with manic energy. "Grandpa used to do it. You plant alternating strips of corn and soybeans. The soybeans fix nitrogen into the soil, naturally feeding the corn. The corn acts as a windbreak for the beans. You cut your fertilizer costs by 80%. You cut your pesticide costs because the pests get confused by the biodiversity." "That's agricultural history, Wyatt," Hannah countered. "Nobody does it anymore because modern combines are 60 feet wide. They can't harvest alternating strips without mixing the crops together or crushing one to get to the other." Wyatt slapped his hand onto the rusted flank of the old 1958 harvester. "Exactly. But this old girl, her header, is only 12 feet wide. She is the exact perfect width to harvest the corn strips while leaving the soybeans untouched. She's light enough not to compact the soil, but to make it work, she needs to be precise. More precise than she was in 1958. Hannah stared at the blueprint, her mechanical mind racing. The audacity of it was intoxicating. You want to retrofit a mechanical relic with modern precision tech. I want you to rip out the dead analog gauges and install open-source sensors, Wyatt said. Raspberry Pi controllers, GPS mapping modules we can buy online for a fraction of what Brody pays. We use cheap tech to optimize an old machine. Can you do it? Hannah grinned, pulling a heavy wrench from her belt. I'm going to need a lot of coffee and a blowtorch. For the next 3 weeks, the Henderson barn became a theater of sparks, sweat, and oil. They worked 18-hour days. Vernon, initially skeptical, was infected by their frantic energy and began fabricating custom steel belts from scrap metal to replace the rotted rubber. The town of Oakhaven watched with immense amusement. Word had spread of Wyatt's Frankenstein project. Delivery drivers dropping off cheap electronic components snickered. Calvin Brody would routinely drive his brand-new luxury truck past the property line, shaking his head at the flashes of welding light spilling from the barn. But inside a masterpiece was taking shape. Hannah rebuilt the flathead engine block, boring out the cylinders, and tuning it to run on a highly efficient biodiesel blend Wyatt fermented from old soybean oil. They bypassed the broken mechanical transmission entirely, hooking up a salvaged electric motor powered by a heavy-duty alternator to drive the threshing drum, a hybrid system 50 years ahead of its time. The biggest challenge was the sorting mechanism. To truly double their profits, the harvested grain had to be immaculately clean. Hannah wired a series of optical sensors, the kind used in factory sorting lines, to a cheap microcomputer. As the grain flowed through the old machine, puffs of compressed air would blast away the chaff with pinpoint accuracy. However, the pressure was mounting. Mitchell Hayes called every other day, his tone shifting from professional to threatening. The auction paperwork was already drafted. If Wyatt couldn't harvest and sell within the month, the locks were going on the gates. 2 days before, the harvest window opened. Disaster struck. During a midnight test run of the threshing drum, a terrifying metal-on-metal screech echoed through the barn. The main drive shaft, weakened by decades of rust, sheared completely in half. Shrapnel tore through the side paneling, narrowly missing Hannah. Silence fell over the barn, broken only by the hiss of escaping steam. Wyatt stared at the severed shaft, his heart plummeting into his stomach. "We're done," Vernon whispered, collapsing onto a hay bale. Nobody fabricates a shaft like that anymore. To custom order, one would take 3 weeks. We don't have 3 days. Wyatt clenched his fists, staring at the grease pooling on the concrete floor. The laughter of Calvin Brody echoed in his memory. He looked at Hannah. She was wiping oil off her face, staring intensely at the broken metal. "We don't need to order one," Hannah said softly. Her eyes darted to the corner of the barn where the bank-owned, hopelessly bricked John Deere sat gathering dust. The Deere's hydrostatic drive has a solid titanium alloy power shaft. The machine is locked by software, but the steel is just steel. Wyatt swallowed hard. If the bank catches us stripping parts off collateral, it's a felony. "Only if we lose the farm," Hannah smirked. "Grab the cutting torch, Wyatt. We're doing some surgery." Harvest day broke over Oakhaven with a crisp, golden light. The county was alive with the roar of heavy machinery. Across the valley, Calvin Brody's fleet of massive green combines rolled out like an invading army. They were majestic, terrifying testaments to modern capital climate-controlled cabs, satellite uplinks, and massive 50-foot headers devouring the monoculture cornfields. On the Henderson farm, the scene was starkly different. Wyatt sat in the exposed metal seat of the 1958 International Harvester. There was no air conditioning, no soundproofing, just raw, vibrating iron. But beneath the faded red hood, a perfectly tuned hybrid-modified engine purred with a low, throaty growl. Strapped to the dashboard was a weatherproof tablet running Hannah's custom open-source code, displaying real-time yield data moisture levels and engine telemetry. "She's holding pressure," Hannah yelled over the noise, standing on the boarding step. "Optical sensors are green. Thresher is at optimal RPM. It's time, Wyatt." Wyatt engaged the clutch. The old beast lurched forward, blowing a single puff of black smoke before settling into a smooth, rhythmic crawl. As Wyatt approached the fields, he could see a crowd gathering along the dirt road that separated his land from Brody's. Calvin Brody, a dozen of his farm hands, and several townspeople had parked their trucks to watch the show. They were waiting for the rusted antique to explode. Wyatt ignored them. He aligned the 12-foot header with the first strip of golden corn, bordered on both sides by the lush green of unharvested soybeans. He took a deep breath and dropped the header. The machine hit the corn and the sound changed from a purr to a deafening roar. To the absolute shock of everyone watching, the harvester didn't choke. It didn't stall. It inhaled the corn with a vicious, relentless efficiency. The modified blades sliced the stalks cleanly. Inside the belly of the beast, the electric-driven threshing drum separated the kernels with brutal speed. Hannah's optical sensors and air blasts worked flawlessly in the background, spitting pure golden grain into the holding tank while throwing shredded, pulverized stalks out the back to mulch the soil. Because the machine was so light and the header so perfectly sized, the tractor glided smoothly between the soybean rows, leaving them completely untouched, preserving the nitrogen-rich root systems for the next rotation. Wyatt looked at his tablet. The yield monitor was climbing rapidly. The moisture content was perfect, and the fuel consumption gauge was barely moving. On the road, the laughter died. Calvin Brody lowered his sunglasses, his smug smile faltering. "It's working," Vernon whispered, watching from the edge of the field, with tears welling in his tired eyes. "By God, she's actually working." For 4 hours, Wyatt cut back and forth across the fields. The old International moved with a grace that defied its age, a ghost of the past, dancing to the rhythm of the future. The grain trucks began to fill up faster than anyone anticipated. Because Wyatt hadn't spent a dime on synthetic nitrogen, relying instead on the companion-planted soybeans, and because his fuel and tech costs were near zero, every single bushel pouring out of the auger was almost pure profit. Then the contrast sharpened. Across the fence line on Brody's property, a siren began to wail. One of Calvin's flagship combines abruptly shuddered to a halt in the middle of a row. The massive header dropped to the dirt, dead. Calvin grabbed his radio, screaming at his foreman, Lloyd. "What the hell is happening, Lloyd? Get that rig moving!" "I can't, boss!" Lloyd's voice crackled back, thick with panic. "Dashboard just threw an error code 894-B. The emissions sensor glitched. The onboard computer triggered a hard lockdown to prevent environmental compliance violations. The engine is bricked." "Override it!" Calvin roared, his face turning purple. "I can't. We need the dealer technician's proprietary software key. I just called them, they're backed up. They can't get a guy out here for 48 hours, and it's a $3,000 service call." Calvin Brody, the king of Oak Haven, was forced to stand in the dust and watch his $800,000 technological marvel sit paralyzed in the field over a faulty $20 sensor. Meanwhile, 50 yards away, Wyatt's 1958 rust bucket roared past, churning out gold. Wyatt looked over at Calvin, giving him a brief, mocking salute. Calvin kicked the tire of his pickup truck in a blind rage. By sunset, the math was undeniable. Wyatt and Hannah sat on the tailgate of her truck, looking at the spreadsheet on the tablet. "You did it, Wyatt," Hannah said, grinning, her face covered in corn dust. "The yield per acre is slightly lower than Brody's, but because your overhead is essentially zero, your actual profit margin is double his. You're netting twice the cash. Tomorrow, we take the grain to the elevator, get the check, and walk into Mitchell Hayes's office and slam it on his mahogany desk." Wyatt let out a breath he felt he'd been holding for months. The farm was saved. The system had been beaten. But as the twilight settled over the Iowa fields, a sharp metallic crack echoed from the barn where the harvester was parked to cool down. Wyatt's stomach tightened. He and Hannah grabbed flashlights and sprinted toward the structure. As they swung the barn doors open, the harsh beams of light illuminated a terrifying sight. The International Harvester was listing heavily to one side. A massive pool of thick black hydraulic fluid and engine oil was spreading rapidly across the concrete floor, soaking into the dirt. Hannah fell to her knees, sliding under the chassis. "Wyatt," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "The main fuel line. The hydraulic hoses. They haven't burst." Wyatt dropped down beside her. In the beam of the flashlight, the truth was unmistakable. The thick, reinforced rubber hoses hadn't failed from age or pressure. They had been cleanly, deliberately severed with a pair of heavy bolt cutters. Someone had sabotaged the machine. And with half the field still left to harvest, the farm's survival was suddenly bleeding out into the dirt. The smell of hydraulic fluid was thick and metallic, coating the back of Wyatt's throat like a physical weight. Under the harsh beam of the flashlight, the severed lines of the 1958 International Harvester dripped their vital fluids into the dust. It wasn't a mechanical failure. It was murder. "Who?" Hannah asked, her voice dangerously quiet. She traced the clean edges of the cut rubber with a grease-stained finger. This wasn't a pocket knife. Somebody brought heavy-duty industrial shears. Somebody who knew exactly which arteries to sever to bleed her dry. Wyatt stood up, his boots slipping slightly in the slick pool of oil. He looked out the open barn doors toward the property line. In the far distance, the security lights of Brody AgriCorp bathed the horizon in an arrogant, artificial glow. Calvin Brody had stood in the field earlier, humiliated, watching a relic outpace his $1 million fleet. Calvin Force. Wyatt stated the name, tasting like ash. His new combine bricked itself. He couldn't stand the embarrassment. He couldn't let us finish the harvest and prove his whole empire is built on overpriced debt and fragile computers. Vernon stumbled into the barn, his weathered face pale as he took in the carnage. "Lord Almighty. They killed her. We've got 80 acres left in the North Field. The bank deadline is 5 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. If we don't have the grain receipt from the elevator by then, Mitchell Hayes signs the foreclosure." "We fix it," Hannah said, already scrambling out from under the chassis. She began aggressively yanking open the drawers of the main tool chest. "We need high-pressure hoses, 1-inch internal diameter. We need crimping fittings. And we need 50 gallons of hydraulic fluid." Vernon shook his head, defeat creeping into his posture. "Hannah, the supply store in town closed 2 hours ago. Even if they were open, Calvin owns a controlling stake in it. The manager would stall us until noon tomorrow just to kiss Calvin's boots. We have nothing left on the property." Wyatt stared at the bleeding machine. The despair was a cold hand gripping his lungs, but beneath it, a sudden wild spark of memory ignited. He turned to Vernon. "Uncle Vern, what happened to the old irrigation rig, the one Grandad used for the drought of '88? Vernon blinked, confused by the pivot. The center pivot system. It's been sitting in the dry creek bed for 20 years, rusted solid. Why? The high-pressure transfer lines. Wyatt said, his voice rising with frantic hope. They used industrial rubber hosing to pump water from the lower aquifer. It's reinforced with steel braiding. Is it still attached? It might be dry rotted to hell, Vernon warned. We don't need it to last 20 years. Hannah interjected, her eyes flashing with renewed fire. We just need it to last exactly 14 hours. Show me. The three of them sprinted through the darkness, their flashlights cutting chaotic arcs through the night. Down in the brush-choked creek bed, the skeletal remains of the old irrigation rig loomed like a dinosaur fossil. Wyatt and Hannah attacked the rusted fittings with penetrating oil and pipe wrenches. The bolts fought them, fused by decades of weather, but desperation lent them strength. With a sharp crack, the main valve broke free, and they pulled loose 20 feet of heavy steel-braided hose. Back in the barn, the real surgery began. Hannah sliced the salvaged hose to length her face, a mask of absolute concentration. The internal diameter was slightly too wide for the harvester's fittings. It won't seal, Hannah muttered, biting her lip. Under pressure, the fluid will just blow right past the clamps. Teflon and copper, Wyatt instructed, running to a scrap bin. He pulled out a coil of thin copper wire and a roll of industrial plumbing tape. We wrap the male fittings in Teflon, slide the hose over, and bind the outside tightly with the copper wire before we clamp it. It'll create a compression gasket. That is incredibly dangerous, Hannah noted. If it blows while you're driving, the hydraulic fluid will hit the hot engine block. It'll ignite. You'll be sitting on top of a fireball. Then I better drive fast, Wyatt replied, deadpan. They worked continuously through the night. The barn was silent, save for the clinking of ratchets, the heavy breathing of the three exhausted workers, and the occasional hiss of a blowtorch as Hannah customized the brackets. By 4 a.m., the lines were reattached, but they were completely empty of fluid. We need 50 gallons of hydraulic oil, Vernon said, wiping his brow. And we don't have a drop. Wyatt looked at the bricked John Deere combine sitting in the corner. It was collateral. It technically belonged to Heartland National Bank. Hannah, Wyatt said softly, drain the Deere. Wyatt, that's crossing a serious legal line, Vernon cautioned. Stealing bank assets. The bank crossed the line when they decided to auction our legacy out from under us, Wyatt snapped. Drain it. They positioned collection pans under the massive green machine and cracked the drain plugs. The golden hydraulic fluid poured out, a life-saving transfusion from a dead modern titan to a resurrected relic. As the sun began to peek over the eastern horizon, painting the Iowa sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, they poured the last bucket of fluid into the 1958 International. Wyatt climbed into the operator's seat. His hands were covered in blisters, his muscles screaming in protest. He turned the key. The old flathead engine coughed, sputtered, and roared to life. Wyatt engaged the hydraulic pump. Beneath him, the salvaged irrigation hoses swelled under the immense pressure. He watched the copper wire bindings intently. A single drop of fluid squeezed out, hissed against the block, and stopped. The seal held. She's alive, Hannah whispered, leaning against the doorframe, completely exhausted. We have 10 hours to cut 80 acres and get the grain to the elevator, Wyatt said, throwing the machine into gear. Let's finish this. The morning sun climbed over the distant horizon, casting long golden shadows across the dry dirt. Wyatt sat high in the exposed metal seat of the resurrected machine. The massive engine roared with a fierce, defiant energy. Every vibrating piece of iron beneath him felt truly alive. The makeshift hydraulic hoses held their pressure perfectly. Copper wire gleamed in the early daylight, a desperate remedy holding back disaster. He drove the heavy harvester into the towering stalks of the north field. The huge front header swallowed the crop. Golden kernels separated from green stalks with incredible, relentless efficiency pouring downward. Down on the county road, a small fleet of battered pickup trucks began to gather along the shoulder. Local farmers leaned against their tailgates, holding steaming cups of cheap coffee, watching the spectacle. The news of the midnight sabotage had somehow leaked through the rural town. People were no longer just curious bystanders. They were actively rooting for the young Henderson boy. The sheer audacity of his fight against the corporate agricultural monopoly had struck a deep nerve. They wanted to see the underdog win. They wanted to see the Iron Ghost outpace the expensive modern titans dominating their valley. Across the property line, chaos had entirely consumed the Brody farm. Calvin Brody paced furiously beside his luxury truck. His flagship machine remained paralyzed in the dirt. The corporate technician had finally arrived, but the diagnostic scan revealed a catastrophic cascade failure within the main computer brain. The faulty sensor had triggered a strict software lock. The Green Titan was completely dead in the water for at least another full week. Calvin watched Wyatt chewing through the fields at a breakneck speed. The angry man turned a violent shade of purple, his fists clenched tight at his expensive side pockets. By noon, the intense heat of the day radiated off the engine block, baking Wyatt in the open seat. His shoulders ached from fighting the heavy mechanical steering. Dust coated his sweating face, turning his eyebrows a pale brown. Yet he refused to stop. He pushed the throttle forward, running the flathead engine at maximum revolutions per minute. Beside the field, Vernon drove the rusted grain truck back and forth to the local elevator. He transported the pristine, sensor-sorted corn in massive, heavy loads. Every single weigh ticket Vernon brought back proved their desperate gamble was paying off perfectly. The moisture content was absolute perfection. The dockage penalties were practically zero. Because the hybrid engine burned recycled biodiesel, their operating expenses were hilariously low. At 2:30 in the afternoon, Wyatt finally aligned the harvester for the very last pass. He dropped the header one final time and sliced through the remaining stalks of golden corn. He disengaged the threshing drum and let the engine settle into a low, rumbling idle. The sudden silence rolling across the valley felt overwhelmingly profound. He looked out over 300 acres of neatly harvested land, breathing deeply in the dusty autumn's air. The companion-planted soybeans stood tall and completely undisturbed, perfectly preserved for their own harvest cycle next month. They had actually done it. The impossible task was finished. Wyatt climbed down from the tractor, his boots hitting the soft dirt. Hannah emerged from the barn, wiping dark grease from her forehead with a ragged cloth. She offered him a tired, brilliant smile. But their moment of quiet victory was suddenly shattered by the roar of an approaching engine. Vernon slammed the farm truck into park, kicking up a massive cloud of dry dust as he frantically leaped from the cab. Vernon looked absolutely terrified. His weathered hands trembled as he held up the final stack of paper weigh tickets. Wyatt ran toward him, feeling a sudden drop in his stomach. The older man shook his head in pure despair. The elevator manager had refused to issue the final payment check. There was a sudden, legally binding hold placed on the entire Henderson account. Heartland National Bank had frozen their funds. Mitchell Hayes had personally called the regional elevator, claiming that Wyatt had explicitly violated the terms of his agricultural loan by tampering with bank-owned equipment late last night entirely. Mitchell knew about the stripped John Deere tractor. Calvin must have hired someone to watch the barn from the shadows. The realization hit Wyatt like a physical punch to the jaw. They had the grain, but they could not touch the money. Without that certified check-in, that loan officer, cold hands by 5 this evening, the foreclosure would proceed immediately. The farm would belong to the bank, and eventually to Calvin. Wyatt turned to Hannah, his eyes blazing, with a sudden uncontrollable fury. He told her to get into the truck immediately. They were driving straight to the bank. The drive into town was a chaotic blur of excessive speed and swirling gravel. Wyatt ignored every single posted speed limit sign, his knuckles white around the steering wheel. He threw the heavy truck into park, squarely in front of the Heartland National Bank building. He marched through the pristine glass doors, closely followed by Hannah and a very anxious Vernon. The conditioned air lobby was perfectly quiet, but those heavy boots echoed like gunshots on the polished marble floor. He completely ignored the startled tellers and kicked open the heavy oak door leading into the private corner business office. Mitchell looked up in sheer panic, spilling hot coffee onto his expensive mahogany desk. Sitting confidently across from the banker was Calvin Brodie, wearing a terribly smug, condescending smile. Mitchell stammered weakly, attempting to regain his professional composure. He told Wyatt he could not simply barge into a private business meeting. Mitchell claimed he was just finalizing the upcoming auction details with the corporate buyer. Wyatt slammed both hands down onto the desk, leaning aggressively toward the cowardly loan officer. He demanded that Mitchell call the grain elevator right now and immediately release the frozen funds to his struggling family. Wyatt fiercely declared that they had successfully brought in the harvest. The crop yield was massive, and they possessed more than enough cash to cover all arrears. Calvin leaned back in his plush leather chair, laughing softly. The corporate farmer coldly stated that Wyatt had breached the contract. By stripping vital hydraulic fluid from the John Deere, Wyatt had committed theft of bank collateral. Therefore, the bank possessed every legal right to freeze the assets and auction the land. Wyatt turned his fierce, unyielding gaze toward Calvin, his voice dropping to a dangerous low whisper, filled with pure, deadly venom. Wyatt accused Calvin of intentionally cutting the hydraulic lines on the old harvester. He loudly proclaimed that Calvin had maliciously tried to destroy the machine and sabotage the farm. Calvin simply laughed again, spreading his hands in a gesture of fake innocence. He called the accusation wild and baseless, blaming the failure on the old tractor and age. Then Hannah stepped forward from the doorway. She remained incredibly calm. Reaching deep into the pocket of her stained coveralls, she produced a small rectangular plastic device. She dropped the rugged trail camera onto the desk with a loud, heavy metal thud. Hannah explained that she had mounted the camera 3 weeks ago to monitor coyotes near the chicken coop. The device recorded in high-definition night vision. She had pulled the memory card this morning. She coolly described the clear video footage showing the hired foreman, Lloyd, walking out of the Henderson barn at 1 a.m, holding industrial bolt cutters. The arrogant smile instantly vanished. The healthy color rapidly drained from his face, leaving him looking pale, sickly, and suddenly very old. But Hannah was not finished. She leaned over the desk, staring directly into those completely terrified eyes. She revealed that the video also captured Lloyd getting into a waiting getaway truck. The license plate was perfectly visible. It was his personal vehicle. Calvin had personally driven the getaway car during a felony sabotage operation. Absolute silence dominated the office space. Mitchell stared at Calvin in complete horror, realizing the severe legal implications. Wyatt delivered his final absolute ultimatum. He ordered Mitchell to call the elevator release, the funds accept the payment, and cancel the auction immediately. He ordered Calvin to permanently drop his bid for the property and provide his storage silos for totally free forever now. The Henderson farm didn't just survive, it thrived, proving that true innovation sometimes means looking back. Their old iron beast beat the corporate giants and sparked a revolution in the valley. What did you think of Wyatt and Hannah's brilliant mechanical counterattack? Do you think older, repairable machinery is the future of independent farming? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you loved this underdog story, hit that like button, share it with a friend, and subscribe for more incredible real-life dramas